And now we would like to move on to our first guest for today, the second day. I'm honored to invite Professor Rafi Melnick, the president of the Reichman University, an esteemed economist of world fame, formerly one of the heads of the Bank of Israel, to give his address on the topic of global and local stability, the economic dimension. Professor Melnick, please. Thank you very much and good morning. I hope that I'm not a guest here, but rather a host, but that's fine. Yesterday, the Bank of Israel once again raised the interest in 0.25% and a quarter of a percentage point, and that has important ramifications for the Israeli economy. This week, the budget is supposed to be voted on, the biannual budget for 2023 and 2024, and that also has implications. And later on, I will mainly focus on the issue of the interest rate and the monetary policy and inflation. But before that, I'd like to make some general background contextual comments. The era of globalization, which characterized the world in the last 30 years, was characterized in an immense increase in global trade. Global trade was the main engine of growth in the world in different areas, and it was very effective in reducing poverty around the world. I talked about this more extensively last year, but I'm merely mentioning this fact this year. We can say pretty confidently that this era of modern globalization has reached its end, and we are in the midst of a new world with completely different characteristics compared to the world we lived in and which we experienced until a few years ago. Today's world is a much more dangerous world. The change that we are experiencing has an impact on both economic performance of countries worldwide in different countries, and we're going to see that later on as well. The transition, the shift, the transition from globalization to nationalism did not start today. It had roots even beforehand, and one can mention President Trump's policy, America First, and we can also mention the Brexit, the United Kingdom's departure from the EU. But no doubt, the war and the pandemic were the last nails in the coffin of modern globalization. The war and the pandemic shocks, these are the main reasons. I mean, the shocks that came along with them are the main reasons for the economic risks which impact the world today. This combination of a possible global recession along with inflation, I think that this is the greatest risk, and there is quite a big probability that we will see it happening over the next few months or during this coming year. In all the sessions we've heard so far, even though there weren't any specific sessions devoted to the economy, uncertainty was mentioned. Uncertainty perhaps is the main element that impacts global economy: the war, the expansion of NATO, the NATO alliance in Europe, the renewed tensions with Russia, coupled with tensions with China related to issues to Taiwan and other issues and other matters in Asia, present a scenario characterized by uncertainty that has a significant impact on the world. The strategies of some of the central banks to change the monetary policy, which is required in order to combat inflation, is introducing yet another huge element of uncertainty, especially with respect to the stability of the financial markets, and also especially with respect to the ability of countries to recycle their debt in order to combat the ramifications of the crisis of 2007-2008 and the 2020 pandemic. Because of the uncertainty, I would like to discuss two scenarios. The first scenario is the official projection of the OECD, and in my analysis, I call it soft landing. You know, a soft landing, everything will happen quite calmly. They do not project in their latest forecast global recession. They do project a drop in inflation worldwide. This is a very optimistic scenario, which is similar to the scenario presented last year and before that. And we know that this scenario was not realized. And I'm also questioning the extent to which this scenario will be realized. And these projections are similar to the projections of other international organizations. I'm also going to present a scenario which seems more realistic to me, and that's a recession scenario, a world recession scenario. And at the end of the presentation, I'll try to tie this in with the situation in the Israeli economy. So let's start with some data. I am presenting here the growth, the annual rates of growth of GDP in different places in the world since the 2007-2008 crisis. And what we can see several phenomena. First of all, we can see quite clearly the impact of the 2008 financial crisis. We can also see the very difficult impact of the pandemic in 2020. We can also see that the red bar is the China growth rate, and we can see how throughout the period China's growth rate is diminishing. And we can also see that in order to understand the pandemic, perhaps we need to come up with a certain average of both 2020 and 2021, because the reaction in 2021 was a compensation for things that didn't happen, didn't take place the previous year, and that makes the picture a bit clearer. In 2022, we can see continued slowdown in the world, a lower growth pace, and we can see the light blue bar, which is the growth of the Israeli economy. In 2022 was an excellent year for the Israeli economy in growth, in export, in low unemployment rates. The fear that the cancellation of the furlough in the pandemic would lead us to mass unemployment, that was not fulfilled, and we resumed pretty quickly full employment. But I think that the projection we will see now, and the more difficult projection, which is the other scenario, it actually demonstrates the hard landing of the Israeli economy from one of the best years in the history of Israeli economy to one of the worst years, perhaps not the worst year, but sufficiently bad that we are seeing in 2023, and we will continue to see. This is the OECD projection. What we see in this projection for 2023 is an economy in recession, but it's not completely recession. And the growth of the larger markets, like US and Europe, continues to be positive. A dramatic drop is expected, is projected, but not to the extent of the drop in Israel and China. As well, we can see the continuation of the trend that we've seen in the past 15 to 20 years. So some data on inflation. This is a quarterly change rate. Perhaps you're not accustomed to seeing it, but it comes from the OECD cycle, and you can see the change, the turning point in inflation. Maybe the inflation rates have reached a certain peak, but they are still far from a 2% inflation, which is the price target. The basic assumptions of supporting soft landing are based on the fact that oil prices have declined after the shock of the war, that the rise in the price of food has diminished. It actually stopped. Prices haven't gone down, but the major price increases that we saw in 2021 and 2020 have subsided, and all the issues related to supply chains that have impacted certain markets have been more or less resolved. And we can even see a decrease, a sharp decrease in sea transport prices, which was one of the components of the price increases. This we're going to go over quickly. That's oil, the oil price. It went down, or it reached about $80 a barrel. That's food prices in the world. We can see the great hit this took after the pandemic, but then there was a certain correction in 2022, and this trend which impacted global inflation stopped, and this is an image we no longer see in the ports. They have more or less resumed normal functioning. So this is the OECD projection regarding inflation, and I call this a soft landing. We more or less overcome the inflation issue that erupted as a result of the war and the pandemic, and we are quickly approaching the 2% a year target. What is the alternate scenario, and what are the reasons for that scenario? First of all, the elements, the factors that can impact the alternate scenario is, first of all, monetary policy, and I'll refer to that later, which has the basic component of resuming to normal interest rates. I don't know exactly what normal is, but when we're going to see the history of the past 10 years, you'll see maybe what I'm referring to. And of course, that has an impact on major instability on the financial markets. The goal and the determination of central banks to reach a 2% inflation is a central element that might impact global performance, and I don't want you to understand this as if I'm objecting to this trend. No, I don't. I truly support this 2% interest rate goal. The impact on financial markets, stock prices, housing prices, things that led to the development of sort of bubbles during the low interest rate period and the drop in housing prices, not just here but worldwide, and ultimately fiscal problems that might emerge and will emerge once governments will have to recycle the huge debts that they've accumulated for higher interest rates. And this is perhaps the main slide of my presentation, and I'd like to devote a few minutes to it so that we understand the issue of interest rate and monetary policy. What you can see here are the the interest rates of central banks since 2007 to date. I apologize that I did not include the recent interest rate increase in Israel from yesterday. So what you can see before the 2007-2008 crisis, the interest rates were more or less 4%. These were the equilibrium interest rates, we can call them that, in a full employment economy, because that's the situation we were at before the financial crisis, and at an economy with an inflation that was more or less around the inflation target of 2%. Full employment, 2% inflation, the normal interest rate or the interest rate environment was approximately 4%. And then we had the big crisis, and we see that the interest rates dropped and were nearly zero for a very long time. And this is a policy that was taken in order to prevent the financial crisis into becoming a crisis similar to what the world experienced in the 1930s. And it was a good policy. It was successful. The world managed to survive this without entering a global recession. But the policy went on for a long time, and the markets became addicted to liquidity and to low interest rates. And I'd like to say that every person who works today in the financial markets or in the economy in general who's younger than 40 thinks that the normal state are 0% interest rates. I've spoken with some people who work in this field, and they think that this is the normal state. They are not familiar with a more distant history. So then we come to our period, and I think it has two components. One component is bringing back the interest rates to a normal environment, as I called it. And if you look and compare 2007 with today, then we're actually back to this environment. That is, the interest rate has gone back to approximately 4%, to a 4% environment. But this but is significant. But these interest rates are still not enough in order to properly combat inflation. We still find ourselves in a policy in which the real interest rates is still negative, so the interest rates of the present doesn't sufficiently curb. In contrast to what was said yesterday by the Bank of Israel, they said that they think that, they alluded to that, it wasn't actually said explicitly, that perhaps this is the last interest rate increase, but I think that they're wrong, and I think they'll have to increase the interest rate some more, both in the U.S. and here in Israel. So this is the inflation in a different measurement than what we're accustomed to seeing it in comparison to the same month last year. So that is inflation over the past 12 months. And what we can see is that in Europe and in Britain, inflation rate is still pretty high, almost 10% a year, a significant turning point in the U.S. And in Israel, we can see that we've reached a certain peak, but we don't see any turning point. We're stuck at approximately 5% inflation. So that's the great challenge. And what we see here in this slide is inflation over the past 12 months in the U.S. in comparison or relative to the interest rate. And you can see that at the right end, the interest rate touches inflation. They've managed to more or less balance it, and the realistic interest rate is 0, but it still doesn't sufficiently curb inflation. So anyone who thinks that inflation will keep dropping and will reach a soft landing to 2%, I think that's a misguided thought. And the same applies to Israel. We still haven't reached a 0% interest rate, even though maybe we need to add that small increase of 0.25 percentage point from yesterday. I'd like to say something about the financial markets. Last year, I talked about the perfect storm crisis, and we can see this. We can see what's happened to the NASDAQ. We can see what's happened to housing prices, and of course, to general government debt that will have to be recycled. I'm going to go over this a bit more quickly because I see I'm running out of time. So what is the scenario? In this scenario, I see a drop in GDP, a negative growth curve both in the U.S. and in Europe. Israel's growth will be 0 per capita. And whenever you compare Israel with other countries in the world, you always need to take into account that our population grows at a 2% rate or 1.8% rate. And in China, we can also see less vigorous growth. Inflation rates, of course, impacted by recession. So what we see is how the U.S. is quickly reaching its goal because of the recession. In Israel, it's a slower process because our inflation characteristics are different, and Israel's current inertia requires a more aggressive monetary policy. Let's look at the alternatives which Israel faces. So as far as the world is concerned, there are two alternatives. There's the soft landing or recession. These are the two options. I think we're more on the right-hand side. And on the vertical side, we can see two scenarios. I mean, this is an economic analysis, but one cannot separate the regime overhaul from the performance of the economy because it has a significant impact on Israel's economy. So we have two alternatives with a national agreement and without national agreement, and each of these scenarios will take us to a different situation. Regretfully, according to my analysis, we are at the bottom right square where you see two minuses. To conclude, I'd like to show you what's happening in the Israeli economy in the business sector based on the index I publish every month. And I'd like to refer your attention to the current time. The most recent index is March, and that's the only index which has some real-time impact on what's happening. And we can see that since the end of the year, definitely since the beginning of this year, the Israeli economy has stopped growing. So this index is very close to, it measures growth and changes in real time, and we've stopped growing. And that, of course, strengthens the assessment that our performance in 2023 will be beneath 2%, that is 0 per capita. Thank you very much.